Nice to see all of you back here on such a sunny holiday. And this is the fifth and last day of our GN workshop on German-Indian theatrical relations. And today we have a twofold day. After the coffee break, we'll have a round table that's sort of trying to wrap up the larger topics. But before we have a very dear guest, Anurupa Roy, whom I'm going to introduce in just a second, but allow me some sort of remarks on how to connect the different threads that we have built over the past days. Yesterday we spoke about feminist performances, but also about interculturalism and intercultural performances. And I think puppetry, an issue that has accompanied us from day one onwards when we talked about critical media history and the connection between media history and puppetry on several layers. I think puppetry and shadow puppetry sort of really is one of those observed or under-analyzed, under-discussed art forms that really is a textbook example for this constant circulation. And I'm very happy that Anurupa is able to join us today. Anurupa is a scholar, a puppeteer, a curator, someone who's a consultant for museums and for archives who hold repositories of different puppets from various traditions. She just opened or was just involved in the presentation of puppets at the Delhi Crafts Museum. It's really a very remarkable presentation. I can only recommend to see that. But Anurupa also trained in various puppet traditions, European, various Indian traditions, and her artistic work circles around the question of cultural traditions and legacies on the one hand, how to keep them alive, how to archive them, how to present them as part of history, but also how to make them part of the contemporary, how to sort of include them in the questions of the day. And Anurupa is just organizing a conference which is going to happen at the beginning of April at the India International Center, together with the Goethe Institute and several other institutions. And she just told me that they just received the permission to show some of Lotte Reiniger's films. So I think this really sort of clicks with some of the discussions. Lotte Reiniger came up at several points in our last session. So I think it's really worth. So please have an eye open. I think it's definitely the mixture of an academic or scholarly festival, but also a possibility to experience many of these films in person. I first met Anurupa, I think, almost 2 years ago, and immediately our conversations circled around two key questions, and that is the interconnectedness between puppetry and shadow puppetry and other forms of media, the magic lantern, the beginning of film as an art form, but also the idea of cultural circulation and how sort of these forms circulated. And in one of her exhibitions, Anurupa created this image that sort of is stuck with me because scholars have long debated the question where shadow puppetry started, either in China or in India. And Anurupa said probably it also was part of, for example, diplomatic marriages that happened around the Indian Ocean. And in one of her exhibitions, she produced an installation of a small sailing boat where the shadow puppets were projected on the sails. And I think that's a very remarkable image that has stuck with me since then as a kind of metaphor for the question how these forms circulate. Anurupa, I'm happy that you're with us here today. The floor is yours.
Thank
you. And please give us some insights in your work, and then we'll do a more open Q&A.
Thank you so much, Peter. Absolutely delighted to be here. Can you all hear me right at the back as well? Super. I thought I'd just introduce you to traditional puppet theatre a little bit because I think it's always a good opportunity whenever I meet an audience to talk a little bit about sort of the legacy of puppetry in South and Southeast Asia. This lecture doesn't have too much Southern Asia or Southeastern Asia except for in terms of references of contact, connection and travel. I thought we could talk about all forms of traditional puppetry and a little bit of where sort of a contemporary puppeteer like me today in India comes in this long narrative and history. So to just contextualize Indian traditional puppetry, the forms of puppetry, what is the subtext of puppetry in India, what is the context and where we are right now. I just want to say that all of these videos, you can take photos of these screens. All of the videos are online, available on YouTube, and I've tried to include as many traditional forms as possible. And I'm very happy to share this PPT as well if you want to click on those links and watch these videos in your own time. Unfortunately, I can't show you each and every one of them. So in India currently, from the last census we have made, and this, let me say the census is a very loose term. It's not like we had a huge resource and a lot of people traveled far and wide collecting data. It's really a lot of individual researchers going to meet puppeteers in their context, which is festival, small melas, also going to through the data of the various zonal cultural centers to see actually what is alive and thriving in whatever form. It's important to understand that puppetry, like many of the folk art forms, is not a monolithic block. Classically, there are 4 divisions: glove puppets, rod puppets, shadow puppets, string puppets. But having said this, it really doesn't work like this all the time. So glove puppet is something that you put your hand into. Some of you might have seen them as children. String puppets are like the Rajasthani Katputlis. They have strings and there's a doll and you move it using the strings. Rod puppets is where again the movement is done through these sticks or rods. They could be metal, wood, various materials. And then there is shadow puppet forms. Shadow puppets are projections on a surface, usually a rectangular screen, and the puppets almost always in Southeast Asia are leather. Now, I mean, except for Indonesia, which also has some wooden shadow puppets. There are 23 living traditional forms in India as per our last census. I might be wrong with some of the forms, might be gone already. There are some forms we don't even know about. For instance, the string puppets of Andhra, the fact that they are alive and kicking, we only knew 5 years ago. Before that, it was considered a dead tradition. So this keeps happening in terms of our data collection. Some of the very important things that as researchers we are discovering about puppet theatre is that the narrative comes first, the form comes second always. Especially in the leather shadow puppets of Southeast Asia, the story will determine the design of the puppet. It will be first the subtext in the narrative, and that's what this form will look like. They're often illustrative texts. It's like a comic book. The aesthetic comes, it's not a standalone. It will be from the local temple wall mural, it will be from the textile. They will all have a lot of commonality. So for instance, if you see Kalamkari, it's very close to the Tamil Nadu leather shadow puppets. Or if you see the Lepakshi temple murals, they're very close to the local leather shadow puppet traditions. The other thing to remember is that all of the narratives have never been written down, except for in Kerala, where the Kamba Ramayan, which is narrated in the temple, is a written version. None of the others are ever written. They are oral traditions only. And again, when I say Ramayana or Mahabharata, it's probably not the ones we've ever watched on television or have read. These only exist in the oral versions. For instance, if you go to Karnataka, their Ramayana has 9 different Ravans. They're not related to each other. So this is in the Togalu Gombayata tradition, which is the leather shadow puppet tradition, which is different from what the poets have written, which is different from what is in the mainstream narrative. So particularly the shadow puppet traditions use versions of the narrative which you would have otherwise not read. Also they are transmitted from one generation to another. So there's the constant changing narrative. I used to work as a translator for one of the puppeteers. Now I've worked since 2014, And even when he goes to a different venue, sometimes he changes the version that he's told me the previous time. So my translation really goes for a toss. So this is constantly happening. It is not static. And that's important to understand in something like puppetry. The puppeteer, unlike I think a lot of us who are contemporary performers, our job is not just entertainment or asking pertinent socio-political questions. They also have a major shamanistic role. So they fix weddings, you know, they bring you information about the boy or the girl's family. They give advice to a family which is in some dire strait. They perform exorcism rituals. The string puppeteers of Andhra are called in specially to perform exorcisms. The leather shadow puppeteers of Odisha, Ravan Chaya, is called in when there is a famine and there is let's say poor rainfall. And it's believed that they'll exorcise the demons on the land and the rains would come. So, you know, in Indonesia, the puppeteer is called the dalang, and the dalang is almost the same word as wise man shaman. So their role is a ritual role. They are also puppeteers. And it's very similar, but in terms of policy, in terms of the way they are viewed or researched in India, we have never looked at our puppeteers in that way. They've always been seen as performers, entertainers. And this has caused some problems in the way they're documented and archived, always. Lastly, the audience. And I think what I'm beginning to understand is that tradition essentially does not just mean generational transmission from one performer to another. It also means generational transmission from one audience to another. So traditional performances were meant for an audience which was contract bound, and they know the show as well as the performer sometimes. So, you know, if you're touring with one of these companies, it's happened that an older person will come backstage and say, you missed that joke. So the puppeteer will stop the show, go back, tell the joke his father used to, and continue the show. Or you've not sung that song correctly. So they really keep them on their toes. Whereas if someone like me is performing a play, I will go to multiple cities, multiple venues in Delhi. My audience may be seeing puppetry for the first time. It's a completely different relationship. Plus they're paying tickets, whereas in a traditional performance, there's a contract with the village. And they've had this contract generationally, and the payment is much more in kind. So for instance, they would give a piece of leather. A family would give a puppeteer a piece of leather and say, can you make a puppet in the name of my grandfather? And every time this man performs, he has to take the name of the grandfather before introducing the puppet. So this is embedded in their systems. So just to show how narrative guides form, both these characters are Hanuman, and they're from the same show, but they're completely different, because this character is just finished the war, his tooth is still out, he's an aggressive warrior, but he's going into Shantam Bhav. This one on the right, he's gone to before the war, he goes to do puja and he's got flowers all over his body, but he's ready for war. And then you have a white Hanuman who is at peace. You have the red Hanuman who's at war. And in a repertory, there can be up to 50 Hanumans. There are also different sizes. So if it meets a large Lankini, you'll see a small Hanuman. Then he goes into her ear, comes out of the other ear, becomes really large and beats her up. You know, so these kinds of images are often there. And they essentially come from the narrative. They're illustrating the narrative. If you look at the different forms of shadow puppetry, on the left is Ravan Chaya. This is Orissa, this is the leather shadow puppets from Orissa. On the right, you have the Karnataka leather shadow puppets. These are black and white. Those are colored, opaque, so color passes through, but they're all made of leather. And now we're finding that this particular technique of stretching leather so that it becomes translucent only exists with this community. A lot of the others have forgotten how to make it. So when we talk about something like puppet theatre, there is a lot of other intangible heritages that are attached, like material, making of a certain pigment or paint, the way leather was manufactured, or the way a certain language was spoken. So most of the puppeteers, leather shadow puppeteers come from Maharashtra. They originate from a form called Chamrache Bahulye, which we now consider a dead form because performances haven't been seen. But whether you go to Andhra or Karnataka or Tamil Nadu, they all speak Marathi. This entire community is originally from Maharashtra. They speak Ada, which is the root language of Marathi. So there's a deep connection between the various forms. Then we come to things like glove puppets. I'm sorry, these are not so good photographs, but so on your left, on the left side is the Pava Kathakali. So most of you would be familiar with Kathakali. The doll Kathakali is called the Pava Kathakali. This is something which only existed in Thrissur for a very long time. Then the puppeteers started to travel, and then eventually it was a dead form revived by a Kudiyatam company, and now they are performing. They used to perform across the world, but they've become much more sort of contemporized. They focus a lot on the Mahabharata instead of the traditional story of Narakasur and his fight with Bhadrakali. On the left is the glove puppets of West Bengal. So I thought it would be interesting to see how the two glove puppet traditions look. This is much more sort of classical for the temple. Those are puppeteers who do the Radha Krishna story and very quickly switch to two clowns, husband and wife, who are constantly fighting and beating each other up. Then they come back to Radha Krishna again. So there's a certain inbuilt irreverence in puppetry. The gods and goddesses are not gods and goddesses for puppeteers. And I was recently having a conversation with one of the shadow puppeteers, and a student said, but you represent the god. So he said, yes, God made me in leather, so I took revenge and made God in leather. And I thought that was very interesting, because he said, for me, they are clans and castes and groups, demons or gods or the apsaras or whoever, and I'm telling their story. I can't be emotionally involved with them. I have my personal likes and dislikes, but for me they're characters in a story, and they are, so when he's talking about Mandodari, he will say, oh, wo kapda sukhane gayi thi, fir bandar aa gaye. He always talks to you or tells you about these characters as if they live next door to him in the next village, and that immediacy is very important for a puppeteer. It cannot be something which is away from him. It cannot be something which he can't or she can't touch. And that's important in these folk performances. So this is, where did it all begin? There's a huge battle among Indian and Chinese scholars and puppeteers. Everybody insists that it began in their country. The Indonesians have joined the bandwagon, and they insist it started in Indonesia. Personally, I don't care. I'm just glad there's puppetry in the world, and I get to be a puppeteer. But it's impossible to date something like this. The only thing you can say is maybe it's something that was used in storytelling by hunting-gathering communities. If you were satiated, your belly was full, you were comfortable for the night, you had shelter, you had a fire going, somebody would start telling stories. You would need to be entertained. Maybe they picked up objects and they were projected because of the firelight on the walls of the caves. Were those sketches the cave paintings? Is that why cave paintings are elongated? There are all sorts of theories. But the point is, you can see, almost feel that this had a relevance which is very old. So where it began, we can't really say. What we know is that they're very old in this belt. They definitely traveled from this area towards Turkey and Greece, and then to Europe. So I talked a little bit about the linguistic travel of puppetry, and there's a definite link with Southeast Asia. For the longest time, the belief was that everything traveled from India to Southeast Asia, but we know that is not true. We know that there's a back and forth. There's a lot of back and forth because ships are traveling both ways. We know this is true for sculptures, murals, so it's probably true for puppets as well. One of the things which is very exciting, I'm hearing this more and more, is of how when the spice ships traveled, and they were very long journeys, there's a possibility that leather shadow puppets, which were easy to pack, went with the ships, and the puppeteers were telling stories, and the conjecture is, were they projecting these shadow puppets on the sails of the ship? It seems quite possible. The other thing we know is that very often princesses carried in their trousseaux with their dowries performers, musicians, dancers. For example, when one of the princes of one of the princely states of Kerala got married to the princess of Kandy, he carried Mohiniyattam, which became Kandy dance. And similarly, that's happened to puppetry and music and instruments, etc. One of the very other exciting sort of story and travel connection is the Arabian Nights. The ships, the Arab ships, the various merchant ships which would all congregate in the ports of Syria, in Aleppo, would bring in their stories, and the coffee houses would be telling these stories. They deeply influenced shadow puppetry, which eventually traveled to Europe and became the magic lantern characters like the adventures of Prince Ahmed, which we see in Lotte Reiniger's film, for instance. So that's a separate topic altogether, but I thought I could show you this. This is some of the maps. These are some of the travel routes that we know that we are studying right now. For instance, the Kalinga Empire had many, many ships, and we know that they traveled out to the Khmer states. They traveled to what is current day Bali, to Siam, and they probably carried stories with them. This is the Chola Empire occupied, for instance, what is today Myanmar. This was a forcible conquest of Myanmar. But we also know that they took a lot of artists with them and brought back artists with them during this period. So this is pre-partition India, and I'm showing you this map because there's some interesting episodes that happens in terms of law and puppetry under the British rule. So you see the Kingdom of Mysore. Puppetry was banned in the Kingdom of Mysore because the traveling puppeteers were often accused of carrying seditious literature with them. So, and they would perform anti-British propaganda pieces, or that's what they were accused of doing. So it was banned, but the Maharaja of Mysore had a very good relationship with the king's tutor. They had the same tutor. I think it's probably George V. And the Maharaja of Mysore shared a tutor, and he sent a letter saying, this is a very important tradition for us. We absolutely, absolutely must have this kind of performance running. The precondition set was that the British would be shown in a very good light in the performances, and they agreed. So the Subedar came to see all the puppets, and I'm going to skip these. I'm going to go right to the end. This is the puppet that was, these types of puppets were built. Now a lot of these they exist in the Chitrakala Parishad collection of puppets in Bangalore. So you see the man on the horse, the two men in the red coats with blonde hair. So this was approved, they were performed, and when they were performed, the audience was laughing because that's not a horse, it's a donkey. So, and that is the same sedition law which is still used in India. So this is quite interesting that the arts and law have always had this very exciting relationship. I think that's it for me to start with. Now I could maybe tell you a little bit about contemporary puppetry and what it is. So in the last 50 years, something called contemporary puppetry was born. It is one of the least researched parts of puppetry at this point. We know very little except that it started possibly with two separate wings. One was in Ahmedabad in the Darpana Academy, where someone called Meher Contractor started to look at the leather shadow puppets, these kinds of traditional leather shadow puppets, and she started to build, use and adapt these puppets to talk about contemporary issues, arts and education, and bring it to classrooms essentially. She also managed to forge a relationship with the bigger body of puppeteers, which is called the Union Internationale de la Marionnette, the International Association of Puppeteers, which started in 1929 in the Czech Republic in Prague, and today has 107 countries in it. There's also a UNIMA India, and the exhibition which Peter mentioned, which is running in Crafts Museum, is an association with UNIMA India. And one of the tasks we have taken on as the association is to locate and find these collections of puppets across India, across the world. For example, you in your university have this beautiful collection of Indian shadow puppets and Southeast Asian shadow puppets. To see, what traveled when, how, why, what are the interconnections with contemporary puppetry. A lot of us who are trained contemporary puppeteers unfortunately didn't train in any of the Indian traditions, because it was not possible always to access an Indian tradition. Recently, in the last 15 years, a lot of the traditional puppeteers are teaching people outside of their community. In fact, they're very excited about this connection because their own children don't want to continue. So they see this as a way of ensuring some sort of continuity. A lot of them are collaborating with animators. So there's a very famous film by Gul Ramani. You'll find this film online, who worked with a traditional puppeteer to make a very, very contemporary sort of traditional film with leather shadow puppets. MTV, when it first started doing these visuals, used a lot of leather shadow puppets. Then television started using educational programs, like there was a program called Gully Gully Sim Sim, which was for children, which used not traditional puppets but sort of derived from a French tradition called Les Guignols, which was a satirical traditional puppet form. So contemporary puppetry in India is a very interesting journey, because for instance, the contemporary puppeteers now, Dadi Padamji, whose festival is running at the India Habitat Center right now, he trained with a puppeteer called Michael Meshke, who had an institute in Stockholm in 1978, I think. Ranjana Pandey trained with the Toon Puppet Company in Belgium. I trained with the same company, Meshke's company, which was by then a course in Dramatiska Institute in the University of Stockholm in 2001. So a lot of us actually trained in a very Western system. But when I say that, that's also funny because I learned Japanese bunraku in Stockholm. So it's a mishmash right now. So in Europe, for instance, the traditional puppet forms were always strings or gloves, glove puppets, which came from the Commedia dell'arte tradition. So they were extremely non-conforming, often disliked by the church, burnt at the stake by the church. For instance, you see jail records of Pulcinella the puppet being arrested for obscenities and then burnt at the stake outside the church. These are 14th century records that you find across south of Italy. So you have a lot of the fairground puppets, as they are called. They're not the classical puppets, but you also have puppets in church. So there were string puppets which were doing, tales from stories from the Bible. So these were the two until the 17th, 18th century, when the colonizers, they find puppets very exciting and bring back puppets. For example, Richard Teschner, who is an Austrian artist, goes for his honeymoon to Indonesia, and he and his wife bring back 100 rod puppets called wayang kulits. And then they start off the whole journey of rod puppetry in Europe, which starts with their own salon in Vienna. The shadow puppets of Turkey, even though it was called the Chinese shadow puppets, come to the salons in Paris. And have you seen the poster of the black cat? The Chat Noir, the very famous iconic black cat, is actually a part of a shadow puppet performance that used to be done in one of these salons. So it's interesting how by the 18th, 19th, 20th century, everything is traveling everywhere. In the midst are puppeteers like me. We learn bunraku in Sweden and come back to India and start to perform bunraku style puppetry. So maybe I can show you a little video of how we have adapted bunraku. Sorry, you'll have to help me with this. And also, this particular show is the Mahabharat, where the dramaturge and the main performer is a traditional puppeteer from Karnataka, from the Togalu Gombayata style. And his, it was important to have him as the dramaturge because he brought the Silakayata Mahabharat into the story, which is a very particular version of the puppeteers with many stories within stories and backstories for all of the characters. In fact, he's someone who knows all the stories of the 100 Kaurav brothers, including the brother who left the war, the brother who protested against the disrobing of Draupadi and was hence disowned by the family. So there are many different stories within stories. Shall I just forward this a bit? Oop. Am I doing it right? Oh, from here, no? What do I? Wait. Maybe I can go back a moment. Wait. So I'm just going to show you 2 bits from the play and then maybe we can do a little bit of a Q&A.
जंगल में खबर पहुंची कि गांधारी तो प्रेग्नेंट है। उर्फी ने अपने स्पेशल पावर के बारे में बताया। स्पेशल पावर? उस जमाने में बहुत पावर होती थी। कौन सा स्पेशल पावर? दूरवास्ता।
Can you hear this?
Special power. Well, when Kunti was a little girl, she had impressed Rishi Durvas with her hospitality, and he gave her a special power. She could invoke any 5 balls.
Through the speakers here. Sorry, can you put the sound through the speakers? Because it's an HDMI cord, so
HDMI load
can you plug in this channel?
HDMI load എന്താ വേണ്ടേ ഇതിൻ്റെ ഔട്ട്പുട്ട് കേൾക്കുന്ന ഇതിൻ്റെ അകത്തിലേക്ക് അതെ ഇത് നമ്മൾ HDMI ലോഡ് ഓ സൗണ്ടിൽ ഗ്യാപ്പിൽ മാറ്റുന്നത് ഡിസ്പ്ലേ ഗ്യാപ്പിൽ HDMI
Wake, my son. I know it all seems long gone, shrouded in pain.
Do you want to pause?
Your sister Gandhari, the Manglik bride. A widow, he said. Bhishma, enraged. Why wasn't he told? Revenge, he thought. Starve them to death.
No?
A stroke of murderous hospitality. Food
The other one was better.
there,
Yeah, the other
but
one, at least on the
never
laptop, you
enough.
could hear. The other one?
So shall I play?
Yeah.
To you, flesh of my flesh, I let you eat your fill, so you may always go hungry.
So essentially, this is Subala Shakuni's father. Shakuni's father was, and his 99 brothers were starved to death by Bhishma. And there are many reasons. Every version has a different reason why. And so, when they're being starved, there's a test that Subala makes for it to, gives his 100 sons. Shakuni passes the test, and he is fed. Every portion of food is given to him, and he lives while everyone else starves. And before he dies, Subala breaks his knee and says, every time you walk, you will remember the sacrifice that was made for you. And so, in our interpretation of the Mahabharata, it was very important that that relationship and the past was brought in, where
Bhishma
Shakuni doesn't wake up one morning and
enraged.
decide that he hates the Pandavas, but he actually wants
Why
to
wasn't
destroy the
he
entire
told?
kith and kin of the Bhishma.
Revenge, he thought. Starve them to death. A stroke of murderous hospitality. Food there, but never enough. As we wasted away, every last one of us, we gave ourselves to you. Flesh of my flesh, I let you eat your fill, so you may always go hungry.
This is the Chakravyuh where there were 7 horsemen who killed the 16-year-old soldier. These are just glimpses from the night. This is Dronacharya. And there's a rumor that goes around that Ashwatthama is dead. And basically he drops his weapon and goes to him. Yes, I'm sure you can guess which character this is.
100 little boys, grubby hands and long lashes. They jostle each other trying to find a place on my lap. I laugh. I push them away, one at a time. I say, one at a time. Krishna, did you keep track of each one? Who stopped my 100 hearts? You or I? Without them, my life, this shell, I hurl it at Krishna and hope it shatters his world. Like he shattered mine.
Yeah, so those were some glimpses from the Mahabharata using both contemporary puppets but with a traditional storyline. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. So with that, I would open the floor for questions. Maybe we can have some light. Nisha, please.
Thank you. This was so good. My first question is, because you sort of also archive so many performance traditions, and you're very clued in as to how they are different. So when you come across a new form as a performer, what are some of the questions that you think are sort of very important to ask? Like, say you were so clear about leather and then some the kalamkari fabric. What are some questions that as a performer you put to every form that you encounter of puppet?
I think because the engagement is with puppetry, one of the questions to ask is this puppet theatre? And that has been a challenging question, because recently one of the puppet forms, which was initially not recognized as puppetry, called Noku Vidya in Kerala, played only by women. So these are rod, they're like toys, they're balanced on the top of the bridge, the upper lip. And this balance creates a certain movement in these dolls or toys. And there was a big discussion about, are these puppets, are these not puppets, because they're not telling specific stories. But then it was a question of, they depict everyday life, especially women's lives and lives in the village. Maybe they're not stories, but the fact that they were told with puppets, the minute something mundane is represented by this dead material puppets, there is a certain focus that comes on this. Immediately the mundane becomes quite magical. And so even though it is not the Mahabharata, it is not the Ramayana, it is not the Purans, it is not a folk tale, it is performative. It is still a narrative and storytelling. So I think it's a question of expanding this argument of what is puppetry, what is not puppetry. But can you even look at puppets in isolation without looking at, for instance, the scroll paintings? So we know that Chamdachiye Bahulye in Maharashtra is so much like Chitrakati, which is the scroll painting tradition from the same region. So there are interconnections which we can't do without. So in terms of archival work or preservation work, you can't say, okay, we can't use this, we must only keep this. Anyway, at a policy level, one of the biggest mistakes that has been made is disassociating the performer and the material. So, to keep the Papuji ka phad and not to invest in the bhopa is really stupid. To keep the puppets and not invest in the puppeteer makes no sense, because then they're just dolls and they're just hanging in archives or they're in boxes. And even if you make the most beautiful puppet exhibition, until and unless there is the person who moves it and invests life in it, it's nothing. And we know that the story is so specific, and it is only in the oral narrative. There it becomes doubly important to look at not preservation in a way of acquiring artifacts, but in looking at how do you ensure that the storytellers continue. So that is a big question, and it's a confusing question. I mean, yeah, because the whole yes, sorry.
No, I'm just curious.
So I think, Peter, you also touched upon this in the first day. Okay. So you also touched it on the first day, and I'm connecting the same thing here, because you said that, that we also have to look into the audience is not static, it's also dynamic, it's changing. So especially in the contemporary time when we're talking about, is there a positioning of a puppet theater with the audience which is more talking about children, so that positioning which has happened, and when I'm looking into the history, it seems otherwise, right? It becomes like the audience is like the entire village or ritualistic. So there are the audience, the profile which has changed in the contemporary times. If you could talk about that how it is, and if you see the Ishara, that festival, it is absolutely a children's festival, 10-minute snippets kind of performance which they are doing. And also because puppetry is considered, I'm just thinking, okay, so because there's animation, right, and there's a lot of, as you said, there are overlapping of performance techniques, right? So the animation itself has become so technologically advanced, and therefore the audience profiling has been segregated in the contemporary time, because I think there's too much of positioning of, as you said again, Doordarshan, educative programs will have shadow puppets and stuff. So.
Yeah, it's partly the Doordarshan educative programs, the song and drama division's very conscious policy to send puppeteers out in the field with message-oriented puppetry, which happened, I think, sometimes in the 70s and the 80s particularly. It still continues, but it was really, the literacy houses across the country were doing this. But also, in contemporary puppetry, I think it's in the 50s and the 60s that the USSR puts a lot of money and a lot of resource into puppet theater. And if you travel across Russia, there are spectacular, very well equipped puppet theaters. There are almost, I think, 250, and they're in small towns. And this, as a result of the Eastern Bloc, spending a lot of resources on puppet theater for children as one of the most important sort of educational values for children, there became, especially in India, there was a whole trend of puppetry being created only for children. You would see this, in places like CLT in Kolkata, or you would see this whole movement, which was beautiful puppetry, really well finished, very high quality puppet theater. A lot of the puppeteers trained in the Obraztsov theater in Moscow and came back. And this movement spread across India very quickly, where you had these rod puppets for children with these pre-recorded soundtracks where the puppeteer is not visible at all. Now juxtapose this on tradition. Traditional Indian puppetry was never for children. Yeah. In fact, any traditional puppetry is never for children. It's grotesque, it's burlesque, it's political, it's sexual, it's, so it was really for adults. And even in the Indian traditional sort of milieu, the children would come, watch the first few hours, fall asleep by 10:30. Then the real puppetry would begin. The jokes and the all the innuendos and all of that would happen. So this movement of separating puppetry as children's theatre and taking it away is a very concerted movement in the 70s, 80s across East Europe, then bleeds into India, and quite a bit across Southeast Asia. And from that is also born television puppetry. In fact, it's in America in the 70s that Jim Henson creates his Muppets sort of franchise, which begins with puppetry for adults, then very quickly goes to the Muppets shows, which is
good Kamini Kaushal and all coming.
Then Kamini Kaushal and everybody starts responding to it, and you have we had an Indian version. I was one of the puppeteers on that show, Gully Gully Simpson. No, Khullam Khulla, Doordarshan, Khullam Khulla. So which is Muppets. So you suddenly then see in the 80s, 90s, the Muppets become the rage. These mouth-moving sock glove puppets. There's going to be one in Ishara this time. So it becomes a very clear demarcation. In fact, I think in Germany it's called Puppenspiel, and now puppeteers, because Puppenspiel is associated with children, serious professional puppeteers chose to call it figuren theatre, so that it's more respectable. So it's that much of a divorcing. We have had people walk up to us after performances to say, for example, with the Mahabharata, and say, what do you call this form? And we said, but it's puppet theatre. They said, no, you should call it something else. Because then we were confused, we thought it was for children. So there's such a strong stereotype of puppetry being for children. And you know, the point is, at the end of the day, a festival like Ishara, which Dadi is running entirely by himself, he won't be able to sell tickets if it's puppetry for adults. And it's an actual economic fact. So he has to have this festival for children only, because he'll get more shows, he'll definitely get more audiences, and if there's any chance of getting funding, if it is with this label of children's theatre. So yeah, unfortunately, and we are a company, we do very little children's theatre. 90% of our work is for adults. So it's something we're constantly engaging with. But I have to say that we were recently in Itfork in Kerala. We didn't have a single child in the audience, because they knew it was an adult performance. We only had adults, and it was really refreshing. Not that I hate children, but it's just that I don't want them in my shows.
But also it makes it difficult for them to receive something. I'm talking from my own. Talking from my own experience, I took my child, who was quite young that time, for Ishara Puppet Theatre, and he was so moved that it was difficult for us to bring him to come, because he was crying, and his friend was also there, and he was also crying while watching that. They just could not handle it.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a really not for children show, it can be tough. It can be very, very tough for them. So I think our current idea is to train a new audience, which is going to watch puppetry for adults, and that's always a challenge. Yeah.
So there are two questions online. So one is, who carries the authorship of the narrative in traditional puppeteers' performances when it is constantly changing every time with new generations of audience?
I'm going to interpret this because I'm not sure exactly what they're asking. So, no, I think the authorship is of the performer and this family which performs. Definitely that it's their authorship. In fact, there has been a lot of backlash sometimes when a puppeteer has gone off from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and has picked a different script. For instance, when in Kerala, the Tolpava Kuthu performers, not in the temple because they're not allowed, of course, they have to stay with the Kamba Ramayana, but outside a temple performance, they did the birth of Jesus, and there was this huge hue and cry, especially from institutions in North India, about how this is okay and how dare the puppeteer move away from what they are traditionally doing. But it is really the artist's prerogative, I think, and nobody else's, to decide what they want to do. They have contracts with their traditional audience who has an expectation, and yes, they have to fulfill them. Traditional audiences are changing, and usually what happens is they can't change the way that they tell the traditional narrative of, let's say, the Shiva Puran or the Mahabharata, but they do keep changing the clowns. Because I just saw a performance where the clown comes on a Vespa talking on the phone and crashes into the stage. So, this is happening. This is a constant happening in everybody's lives. So, the traditional puppeteer uses a mobile phone, uses, is riding in cars. So, I think that's really the performer's prerogative to say, no, you have to stay in the 18th century while I get to live in the 21st century. That's not okay. That's really not okay, I think.
That's the second question. What is the historical migration and spread of contemporary puppeteers, their form, style, and school of thought so far as per records?
Do we have 2 hours? Okay, as for records, I can just very quickly tell you there's a Bengal school which came very much from the USSR forms, which is rods and gloves from the Obraztsov theatre. There is the school that Meher Contractor sort of started, where she enabled a lot of contemporary puppeteers to experiment. She taught them, she trained a lot of teachers. A lot of these school teachers then went on to become puppeteers, and a lot of people could access puppetry skills from across the world. Dadi Padamji is one of her students. He then starts this whole movement of extremely both abstract, design focused, and he also has a design background, puppetry which we hadn't seen in contemporary forms before that. And then there is sort of my generation and now younger puppeteers who are taking a little from here, a little from there. But what is important, and we have now started to focus on this a lot since 2014, is concretely building a puppet school in India. So there's a training program. One is running right now as we speak. It's called the Foundation course for puppeteers, where they get to spend 3 weeks in the house of a traditional puppeteer. They also train in, very modern contemporary glove, etc., etc. At the end of which they make a project where they choose what technique they want to work in. They get 2 years of work experience. So the idea really is that what is the voice that you want to use, what is the aesthetic and form you want to use and choose, which of course leads to a lot of confusion, and then eventually people find their own feet and their form. It's like any contemporary art form, you go, you meander, you wander, and you come back. The only thing I want to add to this is we have very tragically lost a lot of data on contemporary puppeteers. A lot of data has just disappeared. I tried to research 3 puppeteers whose names kept popping up, because one of them actually trained in Malaysia and didn't go to Europe like most puppeteers do. And beyond finding 10 of his puppets and hearing some stories about him, haven't been able to piece him together. So there are many such, unfortunately, like I said, it's the least researched part of puppetry is gone.
More questions? Isha, follow-up question.
Thank you. 2 questions. One is around this contemporary practice. So this is before 2014. There were twice I saw at BRM, the NST Bharat. There were 2 performances of puppetry. One was of Katputli Ramayana, I guess, and one was Katputli some episode from Mahabharata or something, and it was like full human forms, all dressed as puppet, but there was no words, only drums playing, and they used just the percussions, the pace, keeping that, and the core action was shown in that form.
That's one of our shows, the one you're talking about. It was not a string puppet, but a rod puppet show. Yes, that's about drum. Yeah.
So which particular form does it?
It's a contemporary form. It's basically derived from Japanese bunraku. So Japanese bunraku is started in Osaka 400 years ago, and it is a form which is played on a platform, and the puppets are about 3.5 feet tall, and there are 3 puppeteers to 1 puppet, and that enables everything being articulated. So maximum movement is possible. It's one of the reasons so many contemporary puppeteers across the globe now use this form. 2 reasons is that you can have maximum movement. The second, that you're so close to the puppet that you can really work on this relationship between the puppet and the puppeteer. I think it's a big contemporary puppeteers' preoccupation.
This was them as puppets. This was not them sort of managing a puppet like this.
Oh, that I am not aware of.
And they sort of behaved like a puppet.
Oh, this must be from Bhopal then. They used to have a dance drama where everybody was dressed as puppets.
Yeah, I don't know the form, but it was just that they were dressed as puppets, and their movements were just like puppets.
See, for me, that's not puppet theatre. That's actors theatre. That's actors being puppets, characterizing puppets. Essentially, a puppet is dead. It's dead material, which is where you simulate life, move or breathe life into it for a very short period of time, and this livingness is only in the audience's head. It's not really alive. No matter how good a puppeteer you are, it's only living in your audience's imagination. So if it's a human being dressed as a puppet, it's still an actor.
It's not.
No.
And the second thing is that, like say, string puppets or rod puppets, these require a lot of space backstage as well. Like, you know, what they're seeing and what they manage. Is there like, are there certain improvisations that have been made to suit a proscenium sort of?
Yes, yes. I mean, for all forms. I mean, even the glove form, for example, used to be played in a castellet, you know, a small box where the puppeteer would hold the puppet above their head. But if you saw the Bengal puppeteers, they never hide themselves. They've always played in public because they talk to their puppet, the puppet talks back, you know, they try to patch up this marriage and then they get beaten in the process. So all of this is, they're inbuilt into the show. This thing of adapting, now you have, you know, like sets for puppet shows as well. My new show has gloves. It's a 2-person show. It has these 6 rooms where this murder mystery is unfolding. So each one has a light source. So now we do all of that. We're definitely adapting it to modern proscenium needs. String puppets, Puran Bhatt, who's a traditional Katputli puppeteer. So the Katputli was always performed in a Taj Mahal. You know, the stage is called the Taj Mahal. He's removed it. And you see him. And you see this giant of a man because he's 6'3" plus. And he's broad built. And he has this tiny puppet, which is really subtle and beautiful. And he does this Dhola Maru where, you know, Dhola is crying at one point and he disappears behind the puppet. So, I mean, in contemporary theatre adaptations, both the traditional puppeteer and the contemporary puppeteer are constantly adapting, I think.
So, talking about the size of the puppets and their role in specifically in mass spectacle. So, how do you see the position of that body-like figure puppets, or what do you say that in Europe carnival?
Okay, the carnival puppets, yeah.
So, are there any instances in Indian context that this departure from that intimate storytelling tradition to that mass, that more visual stunning, that grand engagement?
So, somebody actually was doing a research on the carnival puppets of Kerala. So there used to be possibly like the Taiwanese, you know, the dragon, there used to be something like this in Kerala as well. So we don't know how old it is, we don't know much about it. You hear of references made to these in older writing, but I don't think there is anything more than this literary reference. But in recent times, in fact, Dadi Padamji has a lot of giant puppets. He started using giant puppets about 15 years ago or 20 years ago. It started where, you know, he'd open events and he was invited to open events, so there would be these big giant puppets. There was one very famous one in the first Khajuraho festival where they had a raft on the river and this huge sun and moon and 2 hands. So that was in practice. Very recently we had Andrew Kim from Manchester. He is of Korean descent and he uses the big lanterns from the Korean tradition. He's contemporarized it a lot, adapted it to many different designs. He did a workshop in both Delhi and in Kochi in Kerala, and now you see them everywhere. So they're giant lantern puppets walking in Sundar Nursery, in I just saw them in Trichur. So I think that's going to be the big next trend.
Thank you. Yeah, Anurupa, I would like to sort of look a little bit closer to this question of translation, and I think these giant or these more than life-size puppets are an interesting example because I know that the Handspring Puppet Company from South Africa, they did, I think Amal was her name. It was a name of an I think 2 or 3 meter high young girl who represented the refugee girl from Syria. And sort of she toured all over Europe. And this was a very interesting performance type because it also appeared on social media. So it really became a thing, sort of that this puppet, at a point when Europe tried to close off its borders, had a very aggressive discussion about refugees. Suddenly there was this stand-in for the human fate that sort of so often is eclipsed by the discourse. And I kind of wonder whether you could tell a little bit about the possibility of puppetry sort of to translate. I can only recommend really to look at Anurupa's Mahabharat. I think it's a wonderful performance. And it's also very interesting because you establish so many meta-theatrical levels at the same time. It's shadow puppetry, it's acting, it's sort of has this bunraku element. So, can you tell a little bit about the ability of these performances sort of to translate, for example, to non-Indian audiences who might be not as familiar with the narrative as an Indian audience?
I think the translations happen at many levels. So the Mahabharat was actually commissioned by the Festival Mondial des Marionnettes in Charleville-Mézières in France. And because France has a very long history with the Mahabharat because of Peter Brook and his long performance. And they were very excited to see an Indian Mahabharat version played with puppets. And of course, apart from watching and listening to various Mahabharat traditions, we did watch Peter Brook's Mahabharat. And I remember the first thought I had was, I've never ever seen a linear narrative of the Mahabharat like this. It's so odd for us as South and Southeast Asians to have it began here and it ended here, because it doesn't begin and it doesn't end, it goes in circles. And the first thing, when we were creating this, and we knew we were going to create this for a non-Indian audience to start with, but we also have audiences in India, so where everybody knows the Mahabharat, or if they definitely know characters, they definitely know episodes. So how were we going to bridge this gap? And the main idea was to really then look at the overarching archetypes. And if you see some of the elements, like this skeleton speaking to the sun, is Shakespearean, or Gandhari with all the bodies of her dead sons embedded on a body is the Pieta. And that's where these images are coming from. So there was this idea of looking at very, very universal images, the archetype of the mother, the archetype of the avenging son, the archetype of the wronged woman, the vengeful woman. In our case, our Draupadi was not disrobed, but the puppet lost her hair. We had Duryodhan pull out strands of her hair, and when her hair is bathed in blood, she acquires this red hair. So it somehow resonated, I think, this imagery, even where we didn't have translations or subtitling, people understood what the character stood for. And of course, it's almost impossible to perform the Mahabharat satisfactorily for anyone. There'll always be someone in the audience who is angry because you didn't show this, you didn't say that, this is wrong, that is so. We were very grateful for non-Indian audiences who were just happy to see it, because in India we had people who came and said, "Where is Krishna? Where is the Bhagavad Gita? Where is this? Where is that?" So that happened a lot here. But I think everybody understands this language of war and not desiring war. So this overarching narrative of hurtling towards war even though you do it unwillingly. And each individual's sort of dilemma, and we only picked those moments of great dilemma, or the moments that are identified with that character without too much of the backstory, assuming the audience knows the backstory. So yes, it was a big challenge. I mean, when we did the Ramayan without words, I think it was easier in a way because everybody looked at it as this is a universal story, and in the end he's left all alone. They seem to understand that. The Mahabharata is more complex, is much more complex to go into. The interpretations are much more complex. So yes, it was very, very challenging, is all I can say.
And I also would like to pick up on the first question we had from the online about the question of authorship, with which you responded in the first place by saying, I think I need to retranslate that because the question of authorship seems to be so absent from these forms.
Yeah.
And for the past 10, 20 years, there's been a huge discussion about this concept of intangible cultural heritage. And I know that you've been sort of in touch and cooperating with a lot of archives and museums. And I think the intangible cultural heritage, by the way, I think it's a very complex and contradictory concept. In Germany, it's, for example, it's bread. This is our contribution to the legacy of mankind, German bread. So how does this affect your work, for example, with collections? And you were saying before, collecting puppets without sort of supporting puppeteers sort of is like just collecting trophies.
Yep.
Because you end up with a lot of dead material. But can you explore a little bit also how you relate this to your work as an artist, where you are much freer sort of in combining different traditions, and how for you this relates to this complex and complicated concept of intangible cultural heritage?
This is always such a complicated question. So authorship is not just about the narrative itself, the authorship is also about the puppets themselves. So I'll start with that, because a lot of the collections across India, and subsequently these were the collections which were lent or sent to other countries, they acknowledge the tradition but never the name of the puppeteer who built the puppet. You cannot, whereas if you do that with contemporary art in India, there will be uproar, you would be taken to court. But this has been our policy. This has been policy that acquisitions of any such artwork was never acknowledged. So I've seen in inventory after inventory which says Tolu Bombolatam, Tol Pavakuthu, yada yada yada, no name of no puppeteer mentioned. And this is very problematic at so many levels, because these puppeteers did have styles. You know, if you see, for instance, the exhibition which is in Crafts Museum right now, I know for a fact that they are Puran Bhat's father, Malu Ram's puppets. There's no mention of his name, and his brother Jagdish's puppets look completely different from his puppets. And this is not about, you know, this is not about saying, oh, but they all belong to one heritage, so why acknowledge an individual? Whereas the awarding systems are awarding individuals even today. There was a big discussion about that. Is how is X puppeteer getting a Padma Shri, whereas he belongs to an entire heritage or a community? And we need to have a much deeper discussion about it. It can't be one umbrella. So then it comes to the contemporary artist who is borrowing sometimes very heavily from tradition or is influenced by tradition. So we have dropped the conversation of iconography so much that we have contemporary artists who have borrowed something, printed it on their new dress in a fashion show without acknowledging who this is. There's someone who's made a video game, he calls it Ravan Chhaya because he liked the name. But it's got nothing to do with Odisha leather shadow puppets. So there's a film called Gulabo Sitabo and Amitabh Bachchan stars in it. It's got nothing to do with glove puppets of Uttar Pradesh. So how is it that these are so free to borrow, whereas if I were to take a Tayyab Mehta painting, or if I am to take a famous painter's work and make a t-shirt and start selling it, of course they're going to sue me, rightfully so. And how is it that it's okay to do this with tradition? Then it comes to the more, you know, delicate question of collaborating with traditional puppeteers. and traditional artists. I mean, their collaborations galore every day. For example, in the Mahabharata, while we were collaborating with Gundu Rajuji, we also had some people who would come and see it, and one of them actually said, hang on a second, he's not just a performer, he's your dramaturge actually. And we said, of course, that's who he is, because it's his version of the Silakayata Mahabharata, and he's the one guiding the writer and saying, no, this is how you're looking at it, but this also happened before it. That's the job of a dramaturge. So I think one has to be constantly watchful of what is happening in a collaboration, and how are you giving credit, how are you paying, how are you, all of those aspects with the artist. This has fortunately become a part of a much bigger discussion. We just had our students who are all contemporary artists living with this traditional puppeteer, and it was really good to hear one of the first questions that they asked when they finished the course is, so when we use these puppets, how do we credit Gundu Raju and Togalu Gumbayata? Because even though I've made something which doesn't exist in the tradition, how do I credit this? So I think those are very, very important questions. I mean, I recently saw one of the airports has, I think it's giant Tolu Bombalatam puppets and replicas of other artists. The bios and the names of the artists of every other form is there, except for the leather shadow puppet. It just says leather shadow puppets. And these are problems. These have created such archival issues for us. To know when did the style change, when did the format change. We can't date anything apart from just this being a big ethical problem.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for a last question. Vishnu Priya, please.
Yeah, thank you, Anurupa. I was just sort of wondering because, the way you were and puppet practices in general go to the epic, and you made Mahabharata, and because we've been looking at Albrecht's sort of rhetoric about the epic theatre, so I was wondering, how does the sort of epic contribute to the sort of the idea of the epic theatre, like the narration, and here the voice and the puppet is different. And that idea that, man, and in your case, the puppet, is also the subject, but also the object. So I was just wondering how does it add a different dimension to the way we understand the notion of the epic theatre?
I think for us, when we were looking at the Mahabharata from this lens of the puppet being the center, the focus, the most important element is for us was looking at how do you look at who's in power and when, who's controlling, who's controlled. For example, for us, the obvious interpretation of Yudhishthir in a puppet theatre sense was the addict, the gambling addict. So our Yudhishthir is a human actor, a dancer actually, and he has these hands made of styrofoam which are holding him, and a head which keeps controlling him and whispering in his ear to continue to gamble. So it's like he's split, but he's two entities. But who's controlling whom? Because as a puppeteer, this puppeteer is controlling this puppet, but it's the puppet who is his addiction which is controlling him. And I think puppet theatre enables you to do this, to make these splits, to really ask you the question of who's being controlled and who's controlled. I remember years ago watching a Macbeth which was done by Neville Tranter, and he always performs solo, and Lady Macbeth is the puppet, he's Macbeth, and she's constantly badgering him, and he's controlling her as the puppeteer, but she's controlling him, and you look at this very complex relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and the use of puppets just deepens it. And I think for us it was very important that this was not an oral telling of a Mahabharat. This was not an actor's or a danced Mahabharat. It was a puppet Mahabharat. So it was important to take, things like the deadness of the puppet. So the fight between Dushasana and Bhim. For that moment, he had to be so alive so that when he's killed and dismembered, which you can do better with a puppet than a human being, it's that much more tragic, the death of the dead puppet. So these were very important considerations for us to insert puppetry. And I think what puppetry does is it pushes this suspension of disbelief. It pushes you to look at, what am I seeing? Where is the split? Who's who? And the idea was to increase that suspension a lot more. I hope it answers your question.
Maybe sort of just to add to this, and this is what sort of I wanted to nudge you a little bit about the question of the puppeteer and whether sort of to what extent he or she becomes a performer in her own right, because I remember that at the beginning of the Mahabharata there's a shadow play, and then the two figures argue, and then the one says, I don't want to be just a flat projection anymore. And then you come out in front of the screen and you sort of start to argue. So I think this multiplication of the character through different forms of performance is really, I think this is an intensification of what Brecht had in mind with the epic theater, because he really, the apparatus of representation lies open. We can see the machine working, and the characters sort of represent when they feel the limits of the way they are tied to, and say, oh, now I need to be a three-dimensional character. But this also means sort of that with the visibility of the puppeteer, sort of he becomes a performer in his own right. I mean, sort of it's fascinating to see, even though one is tempted not to do that, but sort of if one sort of glances, steals a glance on the puppeteers, the mimic sort of is so expressive, and you sometimes feel that the puppet too sort of is not able to change the mimic, sort of really echoes that of the puppeteer.
Yes. Yeah.
So how does this affect the way of training puppeteers?
Yeah, I mean, one of our main trainings is disappearing, and it's so whenever we get students who are actors, one of the hardest things is to make them disappear behind a puppet, because they just always want to be in front. And our essential training is that you're not there, that you're invisible, and that you diminish somehow behind the puppet. And I think then when we force ourselves often to act with the puppet, you're then really very quickly switching to being an actor, being a puppeteer, being an actor, being a puppeteer. And in the beginning, even that is very, very confusing. So, I mean, I remember one of our shows, we had our heads and little puppet bodies. And one of the puppeteers in my group was so angry because he said, all my life, you told me not to be visible. Now you want my face to act. So he was one of the best stone-faced puppeteers we have in the company. He's really stoic. And then suddenly he's asked to do all of this, to have a mobile face. And he's really, really, really angry about it. And I think that is essentially our training. But sometimes I feel like, for instance, when Pava Kathakali was revived, they did it with Kathakali dancers. And they realized that, if they have this moment where Bhim is really angry, they have the puppeteer who expresses it with his face. And it's okay that you see two entities representing this character. So I think this flexibility of choice is very useful, except sometimes it's confusing. So that's something we have to constantly decide and be very clear about in performances, is how much do you show here so that you don't pull away the focus from the puppet itself. Yeah.
And sort of, may I also follow up on something else you said, because you emphasized the puppet as being dead material, sort of only becoming alive in the imagination of the audience.
Yes.
I know from a lot of puppeteers sort of that they still also have the feeling that some life is stored in the puppet. So I remember that when Jane Taylor, the dramaturg of the Handspring Puppet Company, visited our archive, she grabbed my arm afterwards and said, "Peter, you need to liberate these puppets. They really are just kept in prison here." And I know you also talked about the puppeteer and the relation to shamanistic practices. In many forms of traditional forms of puppetry, there are rituals to get life into the puppet, but also to secure that the life sort of at least is controlled when the puppet is stored. Do you feel this is something that carries on to, for example, performative practices in contemporary puppetry, the way how you deal with the performance objects, or sort of how you prepare for the performance but also decompress afterwards?
Well, more than the performance practice, a lot of the psychosocial work that we do definitely points in this direction, because people do invest a lot of their emotions. They project. In fact, there are studies now which are calling this a form of EPR, embodiment, role play, and projection. Sue Jennings has written a lot about it. That's why puppets are so successful as psychosocial tools as well. I think as contemporary performers, of course, we are very respectful of the puppet, because you don't want a puppet to break during a show. So it's important to make sure that, it's like a violin or a sitar. You have to be careful that nothing is not working. Like recently, we have a little puppet in our Arabian Nights. He's Aladdin's inner voice, and he lost his head. So the puppet had to be carrying him very gingerly in the middle of a show. You don't want that. You don't want a decapitated inner voice in a performance. So things like this happen. But in terms of like a ritual to invest a puppet with life, like the traditional puppeteers do, we don't have such a ritual, but what we do work on is breath. We work on breath in a very focused way. When we build a new puppet, we say breaking in with the new puppet, because you have to build a relationship. No matter how you design a puppet to work in a certain way, there are certain things a puppet does which you have to learn about it. So you can't be forceful. The leg will do its own movement. You incorporate that into the show. So I think there's a certain respect we have for the material. There is a certain idea that if you let the material be, it will give something back to you. And also, I think all of us have to be, for instance, we have two actors who are working with us, and we throw our puppets around. They're hanging, they're on the chair, they're lying on the bench, and those two have been very traumatized by it, because they're like, how can you treat them like this? We've just performed with them on stage, and we're really like, oh, but they're foam, and they are put away. So we do get this from people where they're a bit shocked at how casual contemporary puppeteers sometimes can be with their puppets. But I think it's not that we are casual, it's just that we are very familiar with them. Like we know them. We know this anatomy, we know this character really well. I know, for instance, I have a puppet with me today. When I bring him out, I say the most terrible things.
Can we try that? I think now we want to see it. I'm sorry, but you started that.
Sorry.
No one would have known.
I'm sorry if he says and does horrible things. It's not my fault.
Okay, just a brief trigger warning. We don't know what's happening now.
I'm just sorry. It's not in my control completely.
What's his name?
His name is Malvolio. He used to be Malvolio in 12th Night. Sorry, what? He's asking why you're staring at him. Because you're absolutely gorgeous, Malvolio. There I am. That I am. Hello, ladies. Am I here to do the vote of thanks? You could if you want to. Where's the speech? I mean, you wrote it. It was your job. He can't find it. Sorry, he can't find it. Maybe you can just improvise it. But don't look at me like that. I didn't write it. You were supposed to write it. Puppeteers. Always blame the puppeteer. Always. It keeps me in a bag. How's that for rights? Bag. This one. That's my sleeping bag. It's tiny. It's really small. Hot. Smelly. She's just jealous. I'm gorgeous and all of you are looking at me and not at her. Vote of thanks, please. Vote of thanks. Thank you! You can go back into the bag. No! Go back into the bag now. No! It's locked and trapped. For good.
Thank you so much. I'm glad we also met Malvolio. I think we now are due for a coffee break. Also for those who join us online, we are now on a break and we'll return by 4:40. Okay, Anurupa, thank you so much. Thanks for being with us today. And thanks for Malvolio.